This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London. All of our podcasts are available from our website, www.sas.ac.uk.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming. We've had a very exciting day of discussion before this event, which is to launch our Liberalism in the Americas project, which is designed to support comparative and historical research on this highly contested theme. So now we have the great pleasure of having Grandin with us to deliver this lecture, which is the first in a series. And Greg is a historian of Greater America, which is important for this project, whose work has also engaged the history and varieties of liberalism that are found in the Americas. Greg Grandin is Professor of History at New York University and a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Among his many books are Empire's Workshop, Latin America, the United States, and the Rise of the New Empire, published in 2005. The Last Colonial Massacre, Latin America During the Cold War, 2004. Blood of Guatemala, A History of Race and Nation, 2000, which incidentally won the Latin American Studies Association's Rice Wood Award. And his recent book, Fordlandia, The Rise and Fall of Henry Ford's Forgotten Jungle City, published in 2009, was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in History, as well as for the National Book Award and the National Book Critics Circle Award. And there's a forthcoming book, I gather, Greg, edited with Gil Joseph. The Century has come out. It's just out. It wasn't on Amazon. Well, it's very good to hear. Congratulations. A Century of Revolution, Insurgent and Counterinsurgent Violence During Latin America's Long Cold War. So Greg's lecture tonight is on the liberal traditions of the Americas. Over to you.
Thank you for the nice introduction. I think if it's okay with everybody, I'll just stay seated here. I kind of like the high back chair. And thank you, Deborah and James and Olga and everybody for organizing the event. It seems like a wonderful inauguration for what seems like will be a very interesting set of events discussing a very rich topic. So I'm very delighted to be able to share some of my ideas. What I'm going to talk about comes out of something that I've been thinking about for a while, thinking of what is the beginning of a project on Greater America, to use the Herbert Bolton phrase. I'm thinking about American Exceptionalism in particular from a much broader perspective. And I guess if there's a thesis to the topic, to the way that I'm thinking about it, it's something that goes like this, that in all of the debates over what is and isn't exceptional, distinct about the United States, either in terms of national identity, political institutions, domestic history, or foreign policy, there's been little discussion about the one variable that I think that can be considered unique, taken as distinctive, at least in relationship to the U.S.'s global ascendance, and that is its relationship to Latin America. In 1821, there was a review essay in the North American Review that had the phrase, "South America will be to North America what Asia and Africa are to Europe." And not quite. Other liberal capitalist world powers, France, Holland, and Great Britain, tended to, at their apex, rule over culturally and religiously distinct peoples in Africa and Asia and the Middle East. The settlers who colonized North America, by contrast, looked to Iberian America not as an epistemic other, think of it in Edward Saidian terms, but as more of a competitor fight to divide a set of nominally shared but actually contested ideas and political forms: Christianity, republicanism, liberalism, democracy, sovereignty, rights, and above all, the very idea of America. After the Republican revolutions of the late 18th and early 19th century, the relationship between the U.S. and the new nations of Spanish America developed a contentious ideological intimacy, kind of an ongoing imminent critique, unmatched by other comparable hegemon-periphery relations, especially one that would jump scale from the regional, Western Hemisphere, to the global, the world. England's relationship to its Celtic friends, especially to Ireland and to Scotland, produced a somewhat similar relationship that gave form and context in terms of law, justifying ideologies and administration to the latter British Empire. But in the Americas, extended space, what Thomas Jefferson called a hemisphere to itself, and time running from the Elizabethan anti-Hispanicism of the 17th century to the neoliberal Washington consensus of the 20th allowed this rivalry to play out on an unprecedented scale. This antagonism sharpened normative ideals of Republican and liberal America. Scholars have long considered the origins and endurance of the U.S.'s sense of moral purpose, seemingly inextinguishable, distinct from the positivist, utilitarian expositions of international law that took shape in 19th century Europe. Rarely, however, I think, have they tried to explain it by juxtaposing similar ideas, similar simultaneous ideas elsewhere in the Americas. That the Western Hemisphere represented a rejuvenating world historical force, irreducible to territory or geographical boundaries. Now, before I go further, I'd like to just share, not so much an anecdote, but just a kind of an illustration of what I'm getting at that might clarify what I'm trying to argue. Now, one of the origins for this project came out of a class that I taught at NYU on marking the 50th anniversary of William Appleman Williams' The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. I co-taught it with a colleague of mine, Marilyn Young. And what came out of that class was a reading of Williams, who was a great critic of U.S. foreign policy, great critic of U.S. containment, not so much as a diplomatic historian, but as primarily a critic of liberalism, a critic of U.S. political culture. I think he anticipated many of the questions that swirl around debates today within intellectual history concerned with the relationship of liberalism and empire, associated with people like Jennifer Pitts, and related to some of the stuff that Alan talked about in terms of Quentin Skinner and Pocock. In Williams's case, though, it would of course been the relationship of liberalism to informal empire. One of the things that came out of that class is that we wound up reissuing another Williams book through Verso, Contours of American History, for its 50th anniversary this year. James I just gave James a copy if anybody wanted to take a look at it. And in trying to get blurbs for that book, I spoke to a bunch of Williams's old students at Wisconsin, one of them being Joan Scott, the great feminist historian. And she had all of these great anecdotes about Williams. One of them was that Williams was constantly on the hunt for the primal evasion of not so much liberalism, what we would call maybe republicanism now, or mercantilism, as kind of double evasion. One, to the degree that expansion is an invasion of dealing with the problems caused by incipient commercial or capitalist society at home, and then the way the problems of the expansion themselves get ignored and get deflected. And so he was constantly on the hunt for what he would call that kind of primal evasion of liberalism. And apparently his students at Wisconsin counterfeited some document that pushed that evasion back well before Locke. Williams was one of these people who located a lot of the problems in Western political thought with John Locke. And it turns out that he fell for it, and apparently a great time was had in exposing the ruse. But I thought of this notion of kind of looking for this kind of first document, this first kind of document with the smoking gun of that kind of primal invasion. When I was reading this essay by Andrew Fitzmaurice, one of these intellectual historians concerned with the relationship of liberalism to empire, and he documents the records of the Council of the Virginia Company in 1607 and 1608 that reveal this very keen appreciation of the problems that the Spanish jurists at Salamanca had with applying natural law doctrine to justify both sovereignty and property. Spanish logic, they felt, was, these are quotes from the minutes of the record, were indeterminable, they were incoherent, and after 50 years, the Spanish king's friars could only reasonably justify political authority, but not the dispossession of Native American property. The Virginia Council therefore openly opted to avoid the question altogether. They were aware that they would be held to, quote, they would be held to be, quote, not only comparatively to be as good as ye Spaniards, but absolutely to be good against ye native peoples, natural peoples. So members of the council decided that, quote, it was better to abstain from the unnecessary way of pronunciation and reserve ourselves to ye defensive part. So, of course, it's a fragile universalism that fears being judged comparatively against a rival empire and absolutely against those whom would bear the brunt of that universalism, and universalism was carried out in the name of. But for my purposes here, I think it illustrates exactly the kind of ideological rivalry between competing universalism, one that gets tangled up in open debates about its contradictions, and another which opts to avoid the question altogether, first self-consciously, as Williams would have it, but then habitually and routinely, unaware of its own evasion as history moves forward. And I think that evasion that starts in Europe and then gets transplanted to the Americas. Now, the argument that the United States was able to displace through expansion the problems generated by Native American dispossession and war and conquest and slavery and inequality, the problems that these conflicts presented to virtue and its brand of universalism is not new. In one of those Joanna mentioned Louis Hartz today, earlier on in the previous section, his book, The Liberal Tradition in Americas, and this lecture is a play on that title, Liberal Traditions in the Americas. Joanna emphasized Hartz's look to kind of Lockean liberalism as explanation for the order and stability that explains American exceptionalism. But I think if you kind of reread Hartz closely, or if you reread it, it's actually surprising how there's another quality of American exceptionalism that comes out, and that's its instability. It's kind of what Hartz repeatedly calls a kind of irrational Lockeanism. Hysterical Lockeanism, a Lockeanism that can't understand the sources of its own creation, and therefore can't move out of what Hartz calls a kind of adolescent phase. So he wouldn't necessarily call it neurotic, but he was using very psychoanalytical terms to explain a certain kind of inability to come to terms with its own origins. Hartz's book, The Liberal Tradition in America, was published in 1955, and I don't know if, I know this question came up in James's comments, whether Tullio Capodondonghi read Hartz in 1955, 1956, but I don't know the answer to that, and I also don't know the answer to this question, but it's whether Octavio Paz read Hartz, because a year later, Octavio Paz wrote he wrote something very, very Hartzian in his analysis of U.S. liberalism. He wrote that if anything, the U.S. was geography, pure space, open to human action. And where there was an historical obstacle, for example, indigenous societies, it was erased from history. So this notion of a kind of expansion, locking U.S. liberalism in a kind of perpetual adolescence in a Hartzian phase. And I think subsequent New Left critiques, Williams, but also Michael Rogan, would be built on such observation. And these became popular in the 1960s and 1970s. But what's missing from them also, I think, is this larger comparative perspective, placing it within a broader perspective of Greater America. This notion of a kind of liberalism that can only be maintained through expansion, I think needs to be placed in relationship to these other liberal and Republican traditions in the Americas. Before I go on, I'd like to just give three qualifications. First is along the lines of what Alan mentioned earlier. I think what's most interesting about thinking about liberalism and republicanism is less kind of exegesis, a textual fundamentalism, trying to understand, define what falls in the category of liberalism and what falls in the category of republicanism, but more interested in how they play out socially, how they play out over time. And for the sake of highlighting the comparison I'm going to draw between U.S. and Latin American political culture, I'm going to follow historians that stress that overlap between liberalism and republicanism, particularly as it relates to the formulation of the common good. Allen asks the question about he doesn't understand what the difference is between republicanism and liberalism. And I think that the way people would distinguish between the two is first that they would distinguish between classical republicanism and modern republicanism. Classical republicanism, which offers very little room for the pursuit of self-interest as related to the achievement of that commonweal collective good that both Republicans and liberals seem to be arguing for. More modern Republicans do create a space for the pursuit of private self-interest and the pursuit of private self-interest, but they still would argue that there was, I think, a transcendent, that the collective good that there is a transcendent Republican good that can't be reducible to these multiple and petty and competitive private interests. I think that the shift between that classical liberalism and between modern republicanism and liberalism, both the overlap and the shift between one to the other is the relationship, how one conceives the relationship between the common good and self-interest. Whereas where kind of classical liberalism would see private self-interest and the common good as mutually constitutive and interrelated, but still where you need a constitution or you would need to regulate the pursuit of private self-interest in the name of the common good. I think liberalism would reverse the terms and understand the common good as flowing from an unleashing of private interest. The second qualification that I'd like to draw before I move on is that the distinction that I'm going to lay out here between what I'm calling a sovereignty social rights complex, which emerges in Latin America on the one hand, and an interventionist individualist rights complex in the US is intentionally schematic and formalistic. Put crudely, Spanish Americans came to hold individual rights relative to the establishment of the public common good and sovereignty as absolute. In the US, the terms were reversed. Its politicians defined individual rights as inalienable, or at least more sacrosanct than the Spanish American counterparts, and qualified sovereignty on responsible public administration that could protect those rights. Again, admittedly schematic and formalistic, I believe this kind of framework is useful in tracing out the contours of a history that has long been ignored, and that's Latin America's role in socializing and containing US liberalism and US diplomacy. And third, in doing so, I don't mean to deny the multiple traditions that influence political and economic thought in the US or in Latin America. It's the ones that Alan and Joanna laid out in the last panel. Many of these can be found in North, Central, and South America. They include artisan and working men associations, trade unionists, trade unions, urban life, civic Republican sentiment, abolitionism, migration, Christian and secular reform movements. One source of national social policy specific to the US, at least in its degree of its importance, 19th century Western settlement and land entitlements, highlights the wide gap between the ideal of individualism and the in fact existence of a strong and structuring and increasingly militarized state that allows such an ideal to flourish. Likewise, many of the Latin American jurists who in the late 19th century would weave together diverse legal arguments into an overarching theory of absolute sovereignty used to contest what was then described as an expansionist, Indian-killing, warmongering United States, was citizens of countries doing the exact same thing. The region's most prominent liberal legal theorists were from nations, Chile and Argentina, Brazil and Mexico, then consolidating control or trying to over their own hinterlands. They were engaged in wars to subdue or exterminate remaining Native American groups. These nations elaborated their own anti-imperialist imperialism, a civilizing mission that by providing a rhetorically favorable contrast with U.S. Indian policy helped divert attention away from their own violence against their own native peoples, such as the Yaqui and Apache in northern Mexico or the Mapuche of Patagonia. So it turns out that what Williams called the US's imperial anti-colonialism was not so unique. But over time, these two different ways, these deflections produced very distinct ways of reconciling the elemental tension between liberalism and universalism. Now, in the longer paper from which my comments here are drawn, I first do a compare and contrast between the rights component of these two complexes, sovereignty, social rights, and interventionist individual rights in the U.S., as it relates to Native Americans and African slaves. In Spanish America, independence leaders and intellectuals came to emphasize to a much greater degree, at least compared with the social minima of U.S. political thought, the active role of the state in promoting virtuous citizenship. So let me here just summarize the argument that I'm making and then move on to a fuller discussion of the concept of sovereignty. Latin America's more activist republicanism was simultaneously a product of both a colonial regime that openly negotiated the tension between universalism and difference, and a desire to transcend that difference. There, of course, existed a large gap between the broad expressions of humanism that found their way into independence constitutions and the reality of ongoing exploitation. The debates about how best to turn Indians and Africans into citizens or how to end slavery were often hypocritical and premised on cultural erasure. And in many countries, an activist understanding of Republican virtue gave way in the late 19th century to authoritarian liberalism that Alan was talking about, or the positivism, a forebear of 20th century civilian and military dictatorships. But unlike the rigid, formally exclusive racialism that came to reign in the US, race thinking in Latin America could produce powerful countervailing democratic movements and ideologies from the 19th century insurgent wars in Cuba to the Mexican Revolution. They were often manifest in the collective militancy that the region had become famous for. They were expressed either as popular liberalism, popular republicanism, or I think contributed to what we could think of as the socialization of Latin American republicanism, or the socialization of Latin American liberalism, manifested in the 1917 Mexican Constitution, and then in 1948 in the many different rights charters that found their way into the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights. In Anglo-North America, an almost exact history unfolded. Native Americans themselves were relatively peripheral to the Anglo-colonial project, particularly compared to the kind of foundational keystone role they played in Spanish American economics, in politics, in religion, and culture. As such, the kind of moral debates that took place following the Spanish conquest were avoided. Andrew Fitzmaurice, intellectual historian, has noted how the evolution of that primal deflection that I talked about earlier with the Salamanca School, the concerns of the Salamanca School, resulted in an almost perfect inversion of the moral force of natural law theory, with English philosophers and colonists using it not to temper dispossession or debate it, but justify it. The Republican and liberal traditions that emerged from these justifications was complex and had many different political expressions, but at least one strong current of it came by the mid-19th century to link rights to individualism to freedom to expansion, and expansion to dispossession. Now, bound up with the issue of citizenship and rights was the question of sovereignty, on which I'd like to focus my remaining remarks. The United States was born expanding, a fact its early leaders and intellectuals were fully aware of and theorized. Lockean notions of dominion justified the drive into the wild woods and uncultivated waste of the West, and consolidated notions of property rights, while Madisonian ideas of federal expansion were offered as a way to dilute the factional passions that arise from civil society founded on those property rights. Native Americans, of course, bore the brunt of this push west, but the growing body of case law concerning their sovereignty offered legal principles too contradictory and inconsistent to be translated into diplomatic norms. It was Spain and Spanish America, fully recognized despite their oft-commented on shortcomings as political societies, which taught the U.S. how to be in the world, legally speaking. territorial expansion into Spanish Florida, Louisiana, Texas, and Mexico, projected expansion into the Caribbean, produced, as Brian Loveman has recently detailed in his book No Higher Law, a set of diplomatic justifications, legal arguments, and military strategies that continue to define U.S. foreign policy to this day. In Empire's Workshop, I argued for Latin America's importance in shaping the ideas and tactics and constituencies of U.S.'s two great 20th century governing coalitions, the New Deal in the 1930s under FDR and the New Right in the 1980s under Ronald Reagan. The argument, I think, could be extended back even further in the 19th century. The first instance of what I'm describing took place in 1823 with President James Monroe's declaration that all of the Americas were off limits to European intervention. As the high expression of Henry Clay's American system, a broad tariff-based vision of how the Western Hemisphere should be organized, with the developing the United States at its center, counterposed against Great Britain, the doctrine was the first of many instances where debates about Spanish America and actions resulting from those debates allowed a reconciliation of competing ideas about what the correct foreign policy for the U.S. should be, a way of bringing together the foreign policy positions as diverse as those represented by Clay, John Quincy Adams, and James Monroe. In reaction, the rising Jacksonians built a race-based exceptionalism to attack Clay and the American system. The extended congressional debate over whether the U.S. should attend Simón Bolívar's 1826 Panama Conference allowed many of the pro-slavery future presidents, future founders of Jacksonian's Democratic Party, to focus their criticism and build their coalition, especially in reaction to the Panama Conference's proposed agenda, which included the establishment of diplomatic relations with Haiti and continental abolition of the slave trade. As J. Sexton has recently written in his book on the Monroe Doctrine, where Clay and even Thomas Jefferson before him had begun to speak of a single unified America, which shared interests different from those of old Europe, these early Jacksonians, including 3 future U.S. presidents, began to stress, and not for the first time, but with particular weight, South America as distinct from North America. This was decades before Spanish Americans began to talk of 2 Americas, a Latin America distinct from an Anglo-Saxon one. Spanish America didn't only provide ideological focus for the new Jacksonian coalition, it also provided land through the annexation of Texas and territories seized after the war with Mexico for the push west, which not only deferred the crisis of slavery, but allowed for a satisfaction of demands generated by the potentially volatile mix of natural law, civic republicanism, and an expanded franchise that happened during the Jacksonian years. Following the Mexican-American War, the United States' exemplary exceptionalism, the idea that the U.S. could serve as a model to be emulated, but would largely restrain itself from imposing that model on other nations, began to transform into what might be called actionable exceptionalism, that is, direct intervention to remake the politics and economies of other nations. But expansion accelerated the sectional crisis, and in the run-up to the Civil War is the one period where Latin America couldn't reconcile the United States. In the drive west, Native Americans were often cast as children, incapable of forming the rational political society that justified both sovereignty and dominion. After the frontier closed and the trope of immaturity that had long been imposed on these supposedly stateless, propertyless peoples no longer made vital by war, Latin American nations became the new irresponsibles. In the run-up to the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, for instance, one of Woodrow Wilson's experts in the Latin American Division of the State Department drafted a classification schema that seemed to have been inspired directly from John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Using his experience having dealt with Latin America, the expert ranked countries as immature, mature, or criminal, or mature, immature, and criminal, and comprised a series of tests to determine which ones are yet ready to be allowed to conduct their own affairs in a world to be governed by reason. How many Cubas are there, the document wondered. Now, embedded in such questions is the principle that only a morally responsible nation could be sovereign. What was judged moral changed according to the circumstances. At times it meant the ability to exercise effective control of a population or a territory. At other times it meant democratic or procedural legitimacy, with the best way to protect foreign private property serving as the way to as the independent variable determining which of these two standards Washington applied. But in either case, what counted was that the U.S. reserved the right, often invoking its own sense of exceptionalism, to be the judge. Now, in marked contrast, Spanish-American republics were conceived into confederation, nations among nations. In a series of post-independence treaties, conferences, and constitutions and declarations, regional diplomats and jurists dusted off Roman law doctrine of ute possidetis, or as you possess, which had previously referred to control of a territory at the end of a conflict, to apply for the first time in history to the process of decolonization. Diplomats and foreign ministries repeatedly invoked what by the mid-19th century they were calling ute possidetis of 1810, declaring in an effort to avoid potential conflicts among the new states and prevent European recolonization that no parts of the Americas lacked sovereignty. There were conflicting interpretations. Brazil tended to emphasize ute possidetis de facto, which stressed effective possession. Spanish American defended ute possidetis juris, which invested legitimate possession in Spanish royal decrees. But obviously, despite these legal affirmations, much of the region was in fact outside of effective administrative control, including large swaths of the Amazon, coastal islands, Patagonia, and northern Mexico. Border lines were vague and contested. Valuable resources were found on one side or the other, leading to, over a century, of episodic conflict and occasional full-scale wars. Yet every diplomatic effort to resolve these disputes appealed to ute possidetis, which not only solidified the legitimacy of the principle, but led to a revision beyond de facto and de jure debates. For Latin Americans, the doctrine became the foundation of an innovative understanding of international law founded on the ideal of non-aggression, interdependence, and solidarity rather than realpolitik rivalry. In the US, an ideal of individual natural rights harmonized and reinforced a definition of sovereignty conditioned on the protection of those rights. In Latin America, the link between a common good ideal of citizenship and a common good ideal of territorial sovereignty was more formalistic, more of an analogy than a mutually constitutive relationship. Individuals, as do nations, exist not in isolation but in harmony, bound together as equals by mutual needs and limitations, was how the argument often went. In practice, of course, there existed a tension between the region's fundamental commitment to absolute sovereignty and its developing normative notions of social justice and rights. What right did an unjust ruler or aggressive nation have to sovereignty, in other words? As an answer, Latin American legal theorists and politicians held up multilateral arbitration as the solution. In truth, jurists continued to wrestle with the question of how to reconcile an almost positive law ideal of territorial fundamentalism with universal social rights. But in practice, still confronted with an expansionist United States and plagued by their own interstate skirmishes, Latin American nations deepened a commitment to territorial fundamentalism, to absolute sovereignty, through the late 19th and early 20th century. Now, the history by which Latin America compelled the U.S. to accept the basic principles of its sovereignty social rights complex, what by the end of the 19th century Latin American jurists and diplomats had begun to call American international law, is often narrated as a litany of outrages, of U.S. freebooting and interventions and counterinsurgencies and gunboat and dollar diplomacy and pre-Cold War coups. But threading through this narrative of territorial and economic expansion is a slow yet steady revision of the fundamentals of international law, which serve both to restrain U.S. power and make its exercise in the world that much more effective. A good place to start to chart this evolution of international law is in competing interpretations of the Monroe Doctrine. Rarely discussed in all of the considerable scholarship on the doctrine is the fact that Spanish-American diplomats and politicians did not object to Monroe's declaration that all of the Americas were off limits to European intervention. Rather, they understood its prohibition against recolonization as an affiliate and affirmation of their antecedent ute possidetis, and they moved to incorporate the Monroe Doctrine into their emerging multilateral framework. The U.S., of course, refused these efforts. Washington resisted all efforts by Spanish Americans to redefine the Monroe Doctrine as international law, or to read the doctrine normatively in a way, say, that would imply the end of American slavery, or suggest a revision in diplomatic protocol. Through the 19th century and early 20th century, presidents, secretaries of state, and politicians would expand its interpretation in purely nationalistic terms to justify territorial expansion and unilateral policing, most famously by Theodore Roosevelt with his 1904 corollary to the doctrine. Now, American exceptionalism aside, when it came to retaining the great power right to intervene in the affairs of other nations to protect its interests, the U.S. steadily deflected calls that it conform to what Latin Americans understood to be specific American jurisprudence. As the U.S. delegate to the inaugural 1889 Pan-American Conference put it, there no more can be an American international law than there can be an English, a German, or a Prussian international law. There was just international law, whose old and settled meanings were defined long before any of the now established American nations had an independent existence. When U.S. statesmen did call on the Monroe Doctrine to be entered into the admitted canons of international law, it was to confirm the U.S.'s regional authority and right to intervene, as Secretary of State James Olney did in 1895 in the case of the Venezuela and British disputes. Rather than seize on the growing rift between the U.S. and Latin America as a mark of hypocrisy or betrayal of the American ideal, as many Latin American intellectuals would do, and nationalists, jurists such as Alejandro Alvarez, the Chilean jurist, in 1909, developed a complex, almost Hegelian argument that the roots of 20th century multilateralism ought to be found in Monroe's 19th century unilateralism. Alvarez believed the Monroe Doctrine to be evolving in two distinct but dialectically related realms: politics, where Washington's preponderant power allowed it to interpret the doctrine according to its own interests, and law, which, while initially dependent on U.S. unilateralism, would eventually transcend that dependence and become international jurisprudence. He wrote, in 1909, on recognizing that solidarity of interests existed between the states of America, Monroe did no more than serve as an echo of the sentiment that then predominated in all the republics. In this sense, it may be said, and not without a certain amount of truth, that the Monroe Doctrine is neither doctrine nor of Monroe, but that what constitutes its undeniable merit and makes it famous is that such an exact synthetic statement of the destinies of America should have been given thus early in the period of emancipation by a people whose increasing power would not permit the rest of the world to regard the statement as merely utopian. In this sense, the Monroe Doctrine is doctrine and is of Monroe. So in other words, the hard shell of U.S. unilateralism, Alvarez thought, would serve its historical purpose and would eventually soon open to reveal the ideal of multilateralism, which had by the early 20th century gestated from the merely utopian into a global necessity. Now, at times during the run-up to the Paris peace talks in 1919, Woodrow Wilson himself seemed to agree. The U.S. president often admitted that the norms and practices worked out within the Western Hemisphere, non-aggression, arbitration, territorial sovereignty, mutual defense, and the belief that common interest as opposed to competitions of power should form the basis of international agreement. They were the sources of what he hoped he would accomplish at war's end. Latin America's importance in generating Wilsonian liberal internationalism is likewise revealed in the incorporation of the spirit of the doctrine of Ute Possidetis in Article 10 of the League of Nations Covenant, which pledged nations to, quote, respect and preserve as against external aggression the territorial integrity and existing political independence of all members of the League. And the League itself, of course, Wilson's famous 14th point, was directly modeled on Pan-American Union conferences that the U.S. had been participating in at least since 1889, and Spanish Americans have been convening since Bolivar's 1826 Panama Conference. The League's final charter did include a specific reference to the Monroe Doctrine, of course, but it had less to do with universalizing or mutualizing as Alvarez put it, the doctrine that we're trying to appease nationalists in the U.S. Senate who are afraid of losing regional privilege. Article 21, which affirmed the continued validity of, quote, regional understandings like the Monroe Doctrine, didn't, of course, win over opponents in the U.S. And it alienated supporters in Latin America who read the article as investing the U.S. with mandatory powers similar to those granted Great Britain in the Middle East. During the conference, many of the Latin American delegates had grown resentful of their marginalization. And as one State Department official observed in an unwittingly apt description of diplomats and jurists representing a region of the world that indeed had been having one international conference after the other as they elaborated American international law, quote, "I find that they have been left alone too much and have been having Latin American conferences among themselves." These Latin American jurists continued the conversation in subsequent Pan-American conferences, persisting that Washington concede what now had become the overriding demand of American international law, an acknowledgement of the absolute right of sovereignty of all nations. In practical terms, this meant one thing: Washington, then bogged down in a series of occupations and counterinsurgencies in the Caribbean, would have to renounce the right of intervention, something it continued resisting doing through the 1920s. Now, if the discussion of the Monroe Doctrine at the Paris Peace Conference signaled the limits of Washington's willingness to recognize the territorial sovereignty as a universal norm, especially when it came to Latin America, efforts of the Mexican government, the Carranza government, to have the Paris Peace Conference, which wasn't officially invited to because it was thought to be sympathetic to Germany during World War I, have the conference recognize what it called, quote, the ideas of the new Mexican Constitution as international law, particularly Article 27, which Washington's refusal to do that highlighted its steadfast hostility to the region's social rights regime. As one U.S. businessman put it in response to these efforts, apparently attuned to these divergent meanings of rights and sovereignties I've tried to delineate, we want Pan-Americanism and the Monroe Doctrine in its true meaning. Now, Carranza failed, but Mexico's efforts do allow for an interpretation of the Paris Peace Conference outside the Lenin versus Wilson rivalry, that is, as a conflict between Soviet Marxism and Wilsonian liberalism. By seizing U.S. land and oil, but justifying the seizing not as a rejection of modern liberal jurisprudence, but as its extension and fulfillment, the Mexican revolutionaries in ways carried out a much more subtle and arguably more effective subversion of international law than did their Russian counterparts. Not only would other nations adopt the social rights enshrined in the Mexican Constitution, Article 27's definition of property would, as some feared, migrate into Latin American law, serving as the central legal instrument of import substitution developmentalism of the kind associated with Raul Prebisch and the UN's Commission on Economic Development. The U.S. adamantly resisted Latin America's sovereignty social rights complex until facing strong regional opposition to its Caribbean basin militarism and a shortfall in power caused by the contraction of the Great Depression, it didn't. In retrospect, the extemporaneous agreement of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, at the 1933 Montevideo Pan-American Conference, the Latin American demands that Washington recognize the absolute sovereignty of American nations must be considered one of the most unambiguously successful foreign policy initiatives the U.S. has ever undertaken. Latin America's containment of the U.S.'s interventionist individual rights complex was historically consequential. It led to the creation of a multilateral order that allowed Washington to accumulate unprecedented global power and new effective ways to project that power regionally and globally. But it was often begrudged. During his 1950 tour of Latin America, George Kennan, the man most closely associated with the policy more commonly understood as containment, that is, of Washington of the Soviet Union, described the taxes U.S. oil companies paid to the Venezuelan government as, quote, a sort of ransom to the theory of state sovereignty and the principle of non-intervention, which we have consented to adopt. And in retrospect, this ransom, this hijacking ransom was short-lived. By the 1980s, with the ascendance of the new right to governance in the U.S., Ronald Reagan was again invoking the Monroe Doctrine in the words of that hardliner at the Versailles Conference, in its true meaning. And just as Latin America played a central role in the consolidation of multilateralism, the region would be where that idea was first rolled back. The U.S., of course, had intervened in Latin America and affairs throughout the whole of the Cold War, but it did so in a way that it did so covertly, in a way that didn't undercut the diplomatic principles of multilateralism. The U.S. coup in Guatemala in 1954, the U.S. got the sanction of the OAS to constrain, to contain, to isolate Guatemala. Chile was covert. LBJ's intervention in the Dominican Republic likewise got an endorsement from the Organization of the American States. But starting in the 1980s, Ronald Reagan's actions in Central America and Grenada did rewrite the terms of law and diplomacy. For instance, in response to the International Court of Justice's 1986 ruling that the U.S. paid Nicaraguan billions of dollars for mining its harbors and conducting an illegal war of aggression, Washington opted to withdraw from the court's jurisdiction. It was considered a watershed moment, according to legal scholar Eric Posner, in the U.S.'s relationship with the international community, one that George W. Bush's ambassador to the UN, John Bolton, cited as evidence for why the U.S. should not abide by other multilateral obligations. The 1983 invasion of Grenada was likewise an important step in expanding the scope of unilateralism. And then, of course, 1991's invasion of Panama was recently described by Thomas Pickering, then U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, as paving the way for 2003's unilateral war in Iraq. Like most military actions, this one, coming just a month after the fall of the Berlin Wall, was justified by a hierarchy of rationales. But high on the list, and unique in its prominence, was the goal of installing democracy in Panama. As such, it had a transformative effect on international law. The OAS, in an emergency session, unanimously, except for the U.S., condemned the invasion. In response, the U.S. ambassador gave a speech that explicitly claimed or reclaimed for the U.S. the right to intervene in the affairs of another country, not just defensively, but because it deemed the quality of its sovereignty not worthy of recognition. Today, we are living in historic times, times when a great principle is spreading across the world like wildfire. That principle, as we all know, is the revolutionary idea that people, not governments, are sovereign. Concurrent with this dilution of the ideal of territorial sovereignty was an attempt to disentwine social and political rights. So having started with the discussion of debates in the Hyatt Council of the Virginia Company in 1607, I'd just like to end with a discussion of debates in the Hyatt Council of the Reagan administration nearly 4 centuries later. In the decade prior to the invasion of Panama, Ronald Reagan embraced the rhetoric of human rights in order to reinvest U.S. military power with moral authority. Yet this embrace came with an important caveat. As his national security advisor, Richard Allen, wrote in 1981, all too often, when we assume that everyone means the same thing by human rights, we assume that everyone means the same thing by human rights. But when the U.S. talked about human rights, it meant strictly the defense of life, liberty, and property, and not economic and social rights, he said. That same year, Elliott Abrams, Reagan's Assistant Secretary of State for Human Rights, drafted an influential memo often cited as key in Reagan's efforts to redefine the Cold War as a righteous struggle. After announcing that, quote, our struggle is for political liberty and in defense of human rights, Abrams nonetheless felt that the latter expression was too tainted by issues related to economic justice. So he suggested a rebranding. We should move away from human rights as a term, he said, and begin to speak of political rights and civil liberties. We can move on to a name change at a later time. So, lest, of course, the U.S. either be judged either comparatively or absolutely to Latin America. So I think I'll just end there. I have some more stuff about the rights component of the sovereignty social rights complex that I was talking about, but maybe I've talked for a long enough time. We can just open it up for questions. Thanks a lot.
Well, Greg, thank you very much for that brilliant tour d'horizon, some very powerful theses there. And you really have stepped up to the task of trying to grapple with the north-south distinctions and indeed contacts over historical time. I think we should now see how many hands shoot up. I'm sure there's a lot of debate to be had. Well, while you're thinking, I'll just start with an observation, if I may, that we have seen, I think, in Latin America, perhaps, given this historical account that you've given, a phase in which, since really the mid-90s, and possibly much more accelerated since, a kind of retreat from liberalism in the region, and a kind of resigning from the Washington consensus, particularly from the Miami conference in 1993. So I see this is in some way, it speaks to what you've been telling us just now in your lecture.
Well, in some sense, obviously, what's going, go back to Joanna's point about the scholars who kind of revised thoughts to talk about these multiple traditions of U.S. political culture that can't be reduced to a kind of Lockean individualism or a kind of, a Lockean liberalism. But I think obviously in the current moment where you have, until recently, the only mass movement in the U.S. defining American exceptionalism exclusively as individual supremacy, as a kind of distillate of American political culture that I think has to be accounted for. And I think maybe go back and think about some of Locke's original arguments about the essence of American liberalism. And on the other hand, you have the failure of neoliberalism, at least as a cultural revolution in Latin America. And what I mean by that is not to get into debates about whether the economics of any of these center-left or left governments are distinct from neoliberal economics of the past, but certainly the ideal of democracy and the ideal of a kind of political democracy as distinct from a social democracy. I would say it's failed to pretty dramatically in Latin America. So trying to account for the ongoing resonance of these two traditions. But then also, I think the question goes back to how one would define liberalism, and whether neoliberalism is a natural extension of liberalism or its perversion or mutation, in Allen's phrase. I don't think there's a definitive answer to that. I think it is a definitional question. I think that the liberal/Republican tradition in Latin America obviously has developed along the lines of a kind of political and economic liberalism, but it also socialized throughout the 20th century. And it produces a more robust definition of democracy that I think is on display.
Right. David?
Yes, I wonder let me ask a very simple question. Where would you put religion, Catholicism and Protestantism, on the other hand, in your interpretive scheme?
Well, obviously in some ways this is defining Catholic Hispanic America, Catholic Iberian America, and Protestant. This is the original imminent critique, right? The basis of a kind of contest, of struggle within Christianity to define the terms of its own ideas. It also speaks, I think, to what some of the origins are of Spanish American republicanism, right? Debates about whether it comes out of a kind of Thomastic, scholastic tradition, or whether it has more modern roots in Constant and Kant and other more modern Republican thinkers. I think, without getting bogged down in definitional arguments, I think obviously if the question is what accounts for this is the kind of question political scientists and to a lesser degree economists have spent the last part of 20 years trying to answer one question about Latin America: what explains the fragility of Latin American democracy? And I think that question has it exactly backwards. What has to be accounted for is the endurance and persistence of the ideal of Latin American social democracy in the face of wave after wave of violence and frustration. And I think certainly one of the ethical wellsprings of Latin American social democracy has to be the Catholic Church. Has to be notions of justice that are, which evolve into ideas about democracy and modernity, not reducible to the pursuit of private self-interest. So I think obviously religion is deeply is deeply intertwined in trying to figure out the kind of evolution of this competition.
Well, that sounds like a very Hartzian explanation.
Yeah. Louis Hartzian.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, he doesn't really deal with religion, does he? At all?
No, but he talked about prototype, as it were, or almost original sin.
Except but ultimately, this is where, again, not to keep invoking Alan's comments, but I just found them so appropriate. This is where I think social historians come in. That it's not. I don't think it's about identifying the prototype of the idea and then tracing it through history. I think it is understanding how it, how it interacts with social struggles and mobilization and political movements and political forms and state formation over time. That it's not an argument about essence or searching for essences, right? It's or fundamentals or it's about understanding the way ideas articulate or combust with relations of power and hierarchy, and certainly the Catholic Church's involvement and tensions within Catholic doctrine in Latin America on both sides of the political spectrum is part of that social history.
Yeah, I found it a very powerful paradigm to think about. I was wondering within that whether you see any major breaks. And just what comes to mind possibly, and I don't know if this would be a major break in the Latin American sovereignty nexus tradition. Whether, let's say, in the Southern Cone, maybe up in Noche and in Argentina and Brazil, whether those governments, those military governments abandoned these ideas of sovereignty to accept the interventionism, to accept the dominance, basically, of the U.S.
Chile was one of the chief opponents of the Panama invasion in the OAS. The Chilean representative, I can't remember his name. It was unanimous, but that what?
So they didn't want that.
I think there's different ways in which the ideal of territorial sovereignty can be mobilized. Obviously, it could be used to defend what we would call the right as well as the left, and it gets confused and conflated with a lot of things. But I think the ideal of the commitment to territorial sovereignty, I think we see it at play with Brazil's opposition to stuff that what's going on in Libya, which is recently.
I'm not talking about now.
No, I know. But I'm just saying it threads. I think it threads throughout.
It's so powerful, this sort of legal commitment to sovereignty, that it overpowers the sort of political nature of the state, of the government at that particular time.
I think that's true, and I think but it's also because it's so effectively instrumental, right? It could serve the interests of whatever the political state is at the time, also at the same time. So horrible human rights repressors could, defend themselves against the meddling of the U.S. to temper. I mean, that's obviously been a strong, element of this.
Yeah, hi. I enjoyed very much your talk, and I was thinking about two things. One, the relationship between liberalism, the history of liberalism, and democracy. If we're thinking about the projection of American power, for example, democracy was used as a form of justification, not liberalism. And the second point there is also the tense relationship between liberalism and democracy. I missed a little bit from the presentation. So that raises also the issue of the types of liberalism, political liberalism and economic liberalism, and the ways in which they relate or do not relate to contemporary neoliberalism. And I think there's a very important discussion there which we could maybe contribute to.
Absolutely. In terms of the first point, could you just clarify? So you're saying the U.S. justifies its actions in the world in the name of?
I think that there is a very strong history of the United States projecting a justification of its power in relation to the fact that it's spreading a certain vision of democracy, which is rather different from the Latin American forms of democracy, but it acts as a justifying pretext for intervention. The idea that we are spreading democracy to inferior societies which need to be democratized. And that's not just 19th century phenomenon, it exists today as well, it's being reproduced.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that a lot of it came back in some of the history that I was recounting in Central America and the Caribbean in the 1980s and 1990s. I don't know if, I mean, obviously, again, these are definitional, you know, how would one define liberalism versus democracy, but certainly the US, if liberalism is more, if you would think liberalism as being more procedural,
Human rights, rights
and institutional, and it's about, you know, and institutions which could protect natural human rights or natural rights, then I think the U.S. actually more often than not justified itself as the defender of liberal proceduralism. I mean, you see it now often in Latin America, right? That the U.S. You know, they're not saying that Venezuela is, you know, they make a distinction between being elected democratically and governing democratically, which I think implied in that phrase is a whole set of assumptions about institutions, about a certain protection of individual rights, including property rights. So I don't know if the U.S. is just
the ideological expression is much more in terms of democracy than it is in terms of liberalism.
Yeah.
I'm just trying to get my head around, it seems to me you've crunched together two things which may be perfectly legitimate in the context you're talking about, but I wonder if there isn't quite a bit of contingency here. That is to say, you have on the one hand the discussion about sovereignty, where roughly speaking, if I've got it right, the Latin American countries wish to stress absolute or strong sovereignty, the US wishes to infringe their sovereignty. So there are battles over that. Okay, now let me take you through and see if I've got this about right. Maybe very simplistic. Now that's what great powers, superpowers, hegemons, top countries tend to do. The Soviets would have done it, the Chinese are probably doing it. In other words, strong, powerful countries like to infringe sovereignty, weak countries like to defend sovereignty by any which way they can, including invoking multilateral or other institutions. That's fine. Now the second argument is about social rights as against other forms of rights. Now I agree again that there is something of a tension here. I wouldn't wish to rarefy it too much, but there clearly is some sense in which some Latin American countries or laws or projects or constitutions place more stress on social rights, whereas the US historically has tended to place more emphasis on political and civil rights, going back to the Constitution or whatever else. However, it seems to me that that's a product of the relationship. I don't see any necessary connection between these two things. For example, David raised the question of Catholics or religion. Catholics, almost by definition in Latin America, would not place supreme value on sovereignty, because for the very obvious reason they belong to a universal church, which if you are messing with the Catholics in one country, it is your duty to support them. So, you know, that trumps national sovereignty by definition in many cases. And at the same time, many Catholics, or those particularly more on the left, would tend also to stress social rights. So I can't see anything that says you cannot believe in weak sovereignty and strong social rights. You can permutate this any which way. Although I agree with you, I think there is a sense in which the US, being the hegemon it is, with the sort of inherited set of interests and laws and constitution it has, is likely to intervene in opposition to or not in support of social rights. But then if it was the Soviet Union, it would have a different transcript, a different set of principles. So what I'm sort of suggesting is that these two things are real. They happen to come together in the US, but I don't think that I can see there's any necessary connection between those two political or ideological postures. So would you agree?
Well, there's a lot of great points, and let me see if I can suss them out a little bit. In terms of the comparison between the US and the Soviet Union, or any great power that justifies a kind of weak notion of sovereignty for other people but strong for ourselves, I think that that's true to some degree, but I think there's something very particular about the US's notion of sovereignty, an ideal of sovereignty based on the defense of the natural rights of people, right? You know, so there is a mutually constitutive relationship between its expansionist notion in which it could violate the sovereignty of another nation when that nation is deemed to not be protecting the natural rights, and chief among them being property rights. I think that really, it's more than just a, I think there's something very specific about that. The second thing about is the comparison with the Soviet Union and the U.S. is this highlights exactly what is unique about the U.S.'s expansion as a global world power, is its relationship to Latin America. I can't think of any other aspiring and actual empire, informal or formal, that has had such a long period of extended engagement over peoples that are challenging the terms of its own ethics. This is what I meant by immanent critique. Like, so Britain and India, I mean, these are, the points of, this distinct religions, distinct cultures. Is that Latin America is challenging the same, is contesting the U.S. on its own ideological terms about normative values of rights and sovereignty. And I think that has a force that's very distinctive, that you don't see in terms of other superpowers. The third point about in Latin America, what the relationship is, strong sovereignty to social rights, I agree with you. This is what I was trying to say, where I think that the relationship in the U.S. between a kind of interventionist notion of sovereignty and individual notion of rights is actually interrelated and mutually constitutive. In Latin America, the relationship between social rights and sovereignty is, I think, more analogous or formalistic and historical. The fact is that, that the social rights did develop for a number of different reasons in Latin America, including the influence of Catholicism, but other things, and the strong notion of sovereignty having to do with the nature of independence. So it's both historical and in some way, and when these legal theorists like Alejandro Alvarez, in some ways they're going back to Vittoria, who likewise kind of wrestled with this analogy of a kind of universal natural rights. Communities are analogous to, nation-state empires or polities are analogous to individuals. They exist, they exist as, within a community of nations or community of people. So in some ways, that relationship, I think, is much more tentative and contingent is the word you use, which I think is right, and attempts to link and attempts to make them more than that, or more analogous than I think what you saw in the United States.
Just follow up very quickly. The immanent critique, the phrase you used to describe as a Latin American adversarial stance towards the US,
and vice versa,
is very strong in respect of sovereignty. That I agree, but that's because the US is the Colosso del Norte. It is the powerful hegemon against which, particularly if you're Mexico or the Caribbean or Central America, that's very immediate and threatening, and history tells you that. The social rights argument strikes me as much weaker. After all, there's been a much greater defence of social rights in Western Europe, social democracy. So why is that not the immanent critique of the US?
Because I think that ultimately at the heart of social rights is an argument about property, and that's also where it links to sovereignty. And so, so the U.S.'s capitulation or accommodation to the idea of nationalization and land reform. And I think ultimately, obviously there are origins and sources of social rights in the United States that can't be just, it's not a strong argument that Latin America socialized U.S. liberalism. But certainly I think the Franklin Delano Roosevelt and then subsequent administrations coming to terms with the legitimacy of the idea of nationalization and land reform. I think that's ultimately I think comes down to property rights. And you see this. There's this stray remark in Herbert Bolton. Herbert Bolton has the great epic of Greater America, where he's trying to sketch out this history of Greater America, and he's looking for similarities, and he's fumbling around, and he's drawing analogies between the nations of Greater America and the nations of Greater Europe. Of course, there are no nations in Greater Europe. It's metropoles and their empires. So that the analogy doesn't quite work that he's striving for. But he has this stray remark about how the rights of the common people, rights of the common. This is 1933. This is before Franklin Delano Roosevelt's inauguration, and I think FDR was elected, but he wasn't yet inaugurated. And and Bolton has this stray remark about how the rights of the common man, which are found in Mexico, are starting to be heard in the United States. So, you know, there's this kind of way, this kind of opening in that essay for understanding, you know, this contested notion of property as the entry point into thinking about this. So I think that I agree with you that the sovereignty argument is much stronger in terms of an imminent critique. But I think that, you know, I think the constant, you know, I think that it could also be found in the realm of social rights, and again, in terms of the right property law.
Yes?
In this conversation you had with Alan, as for the social rights and for sovereignty, we were here going, well, you know, the way that the US or British colonies and some of the Caribbean and the Spanish and Brazilian, they had, and Portuguese, they had about slavery, and their definition of slavery as property right is a good example for your argument, I think. Now, when David brought the issue of whether this is the usual difference between Catholicism and Protestantism, I couldn't help but thinking that France is Catholic as well, and has a very different notion of social rights. And in this relation with sovereignty, or this sort of counter-argument, or counterpoint with sovereignty that you were making, will you make any room for another possibility to describe these differences in Latin America and this challenge or mirror for the US, that is the nature of authority in the Spanish constitutional tradition? Because when you think of sovereignty, I think at least on two components. One is identity, and has a lot to do with nation and nationality and national identities, and this is very strong in the US. We stumbled at this idea of nationalism and the national identity and nationalities in the 19th century, and this is something that, you know, is, at least in Spain, is still on the making. And there is authority for sovereignty. And in the Spanish constitutional tradition, the notion of authority was associated with the moral nature, which is different from the English constitutional tradition. So I don't think that, you know, I think I buy these differences you find. I would like to explore other causes for that, other roots, rather than this sort of pedestrian Catholicism and Protestantism. So I was wondering.
Well, yeah, it's certainly, I think, in political theory, I think, you know, kind of French rights tradition, kind of the classic republicanism or even modern republicanism, the notion that virtue is going to be invested in a strong executive is related to, obviously, sovereignty, because then that executive presides over a state that's sovereign. You know, I think that's ways in which the relationship between social rights and sovereignty might be less than just analogous or formalistic. There may be a more constitutive relationship. Kind of that, you know, Anthony Pagnan's argument about Simón Bolívar, that, you know, he appreciated the federal expansion of the United States and his notion of a virtue being rooted in a kind of civil society that's protected by the state, but didn't believe that the conditions existed for it in Spanish America. So that accounts for a much more robust view of an executive creating virtue, and investing in the role of the state to make men happy and make men good, as opposed to the pursuit of private interests. So I think you're absolutely right. The sources of it are certainly well beyond Catholicism, and I didn't mean to suggest that I thought they were rooted in that exclusively in any degree. But I think that you're absolutely right about the role of the state and sovereignty. But then also, just to go back to this question about social rights, and then what I forgot to mention is just Latin Americans' contribution to the UN Declaration of I find it staggering that there's so much intellectual history, European intellectual historians, most of them based in New York at Columbia, that are now interested in the developing world and the creation of modern liberalism in different ways. Mark Mazzara's book on the UN, Samuel Moyne's on human rights, and just the remarkable degree Latin America is excluded from that conversation. Latin America's contribution to social rights starting with the first fully conceived social democratic constitution in the world, was Mexico, and how that migrates into these draft charters, which find their way into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or other ways in which social rights, it may not making a strong case for the influence, the role of Latin American socializing U.S. liberalism, but certainly putting social rights on the post-World War II agenda, which become an important moral instrument in the U.S.'s in the global order that the U.S. defends and projects its power through after World War II is I think a key element of this.
This again.
Just a real quick thing, it might be useful to strengthen your argument by putting a little element in there that the U.S. tries, the U.S. government, the U.S. elites, etc., tried to discredit this social rights in Latin America by calling it communist, for 50, 60, 70 years. So therefore, it undercuts any legitimacy. They're just a bunch of communists, rather than recognizing that these are legitimate social rights.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, absolutely, and a lot of the stuff goes back to the debate of, I'm just beginning this project, so I don't, Mexicans may know more about this, but Carranza sends Alberto Pani to Paris to argue for the acceptance of Article 27 into the canons of international law, and it's clear that opponents of this are terrified. They're freaked out because because obviously property law had evolved well beyond its Lockean roots, to be a complicated mix of a domain, the state, and state's ability to grant and regulate property rights in the U.S. But they explicitly argue. They explicitly say that this is an extension of that argument into a dangerous realm. And they clearly see it as they don't say it's, at that point they don't say it's communist, but they see it almost equally as a threat.
Can you clarify a little bit more what you understand these social rights to be? I just have two questions. One is, are you introducing a kind of valorative value judgment in counterposing?
Yeah.
Can you be more explicit about
Yeah.
that? And the second is, apart from the Catholic issue and maybe how that then evolves into some kind of social right tradition, it seems to me as a historian of the 20th century Latin America that a lot of the things that we would call social rights don't necessarily have a local origin. I mean, they are a product of ideas that are going around the world in a much more dynamic way than just being originated locally. So maybe I'm misunderstanding what you mean by social rights, but
I think that they go around the world. I think they're as organic to Latin America as they are to any other place. I would argue. I mean, certainly, again, the world's first social democratic constitution was Mexico. Latin America's contribution to the UN Declaration of Human Rights through Hernan Santa Cruz, this goes back to, he was a Jesuit-educated jurist, a lifelong friend of Salvador Allende, was instrumental in being the interlocutor to Eleanor Roosevelt's committee on the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and basically, almost all of the social rights that we think of associated in that document have its origins in Latin American in the OAS's Pan-American, the OAS's Declaration of Human Rights. So I think obviously they're not reducible specifically to Latin America, but I think they're as organically produced in Latin America as they produced anywhere. And in terms of normative, I guess I would fall more fully on the sovereignty social rights side of than the interventionist-individual rights. I think it's just a more fulsome and more robust notion of democracy that entails some form of equality than just individual rights, which I think are ultimately unsustainable.
But isn't the irony that that form of democracy has been so systematically denied throughout Latin America?
Which is exactly why the real historical question is explaining the persistence of the ideal, and why in other comparable regions where humanist and social democratic movements were met with such repression and such repeated frustration, fundamentalism or extremism or militancy emerged, accounting for in other regions, but in Latin. But why that hasn't happened in Latin America? I mean, and again, and the other thing, so that's well, anyway, I think that's exactly right. It's exactly when you acknowledge, when you realize just the systematic denial of the rights, how the ideal persists over time. And it seems to be inextinguishable.
If I may make another comment, when we consider these issues during the 20th century, we're looking at the endgame of issues which have their origin in much more anterior periods. I'm not an 18th century historian, but I suspect that quite a lot of it starts about that time, and it starts most obviously in the birth of Anglo-Saxon liberalism, which is American and British, which is a very long and complicated story indeed. But there are some very striking contrasts around the end of the 18th century, or possibly before. I would defer to higher authorities who are experts on this. But there were some clear differences between the Anglo-Saxon tradition at that time, which leads to the birth of individualism and rights of property and so forth. Perhaps they have their principal origin in Locke. But with the Spanish-American tradition, or Portuguese as well, that does not lead in those directions, and which, moreover, through the formation of a different kind of liberalism in Latin America, does not produce that form of individual, and thus ancient notions of social rights that existed in all countries were not overcome in Latin America, not destroyed or subverted in Latin America in the same way as they were elsewhere. Now, the real qualification I have for that, and again it reflects on my ignorance about American history, because Americans constantly proclaim their exceptionalism, and one of the most fundamental aspects of that exceptionalism is their cult of the individual, which is said to precede the revolution itself. Now, put simply, I think the answer to this lies somewhere in the 18th century. Do you agree?
No. And the reason I don't agree is to identify the ideological origins or well springs of anything is not to explain its endurance or persistence or mutation. And I think that has to do with the shape of Spanish colonialism. I only touched on this briefly. It's a colonial system that eventually came to be founded on a form of universalism, but then consciously organized difference. Organized its administrative and theological structures around the existence of difference. The land structure that these independent nations inherited, and I think that the social and economic so I think that to identify the ideological or intellectual origins of something doesn't explain the history of it, and I think that is a long history, and part of that history is ongoing conflict with the United States, as living in the shadow of an expansionist, also universalizing liberal republic that claimed to defend the ideal of what was exceptional about America in its own terms. But I think you're absolutely right about American exceptionalism, and the question is, where is that exceptionalism rooted? Is it rooted in the singular nation, or is it rooted in the Western Hemisphere as a whole?
I'm listening to all this discussion about rights, and I wonder what happens if you extend the discussion in both cases to the flip side of that, which is obligation, which is the key part of any sort of relationship between rights and obligations, and that sort of key nexus of liberal political thought. And I wonder if you can draw similar comparisons and contrasts between the ways in which obligations as a concept gets played out in the US and then Latin
Well, I don't know that much about the U.S., but in terms of Latin America, I would definitely agree. I mean, I think one of the things that makes, you know, if we think of, you know, if we think of the church, if we think of the state, if we think of the family as being the kind of venues in which ideas of where justice reside, or where a just society emerge, and where these ideas of, you know, these abstractions of liberalism get felt and lived. They're both producing these ideas, so people are both are defending these institutions and trying to escape from them at the same time, right? I think this is both, you know, it's both rights and obligations, right? So it's you know, it's the paternalistic relations of the landed class. It's the obligations embedded in the Catholic Church. It's patriarchy. Then it eventually becomes the nation state. I mean, to put it in crude Marxist terms, it's dialectical. It's like these institutions are both the sources of emancipation and sources of oppression at the same time. And I think that counts for the strength of social movements often in Latin America and their endurance. That they're often organized around. They often emerge out of very venues that people are fighting against in some ways. And I think that in some oblique way speaks to your question of obligation and rights. That it's not just about individual rights. It's about a sense of solidarity, which obligation implies.
In Cambridge, for those who don't know me, I find the lecture very interesting and thought-provoking. And particularly, I think it's interesting. I'm grateful for the distinction between this framework about individual rights and social rights. And I was wondering, because it seems to me that, and you suggested in the presentation that in 1933 there is a tremendous shift in the inter-American, at least when thinking about inter-American relations, because I find the distinction useful to think in a sort of long-term process in the history of Latin American relations. And I was wondering whether, since 1933, when the United States commits itself not to intervene in the Americas, and then later, during the Cold War period, when the multilateral system, or at least the Organization of American States, becomes more of a multilateral system, whether since 1933 and more importantly since the Cold War, whether there is an engagement between these two frameworks since those days, and particularly during the Cold War, because the United States, I'm thinking of the case when the United States is excluding Cuba from the Organization of the American States, and it seems to me that the United States is using a multilateral system for to sort of strengthen its global power. So I was wondering whether you think that the multilateral system, the multilateral and unilateral sort of a combination engagement in the inter-American system also contributed to strengthen U.S. hegemony since 1933.
Oh, yeah. First of all, let me say that Juan Carlos, right?
Juan Pablo,
sorry. In thinking about this, I'm struck that, I mean, American international law is this fascinating topic, and it's kind of this paucity of stuff on Alejandro Alvarez and these American law theorists. American international law are amazing, but Juan Pablo is writing his dissertation on the topic, so it's really terrific that it's finally getting some attention. But yeah, yeah, absolutely, and maybe I flew by it in passing too quickly. It doesn't just contain and socialize U.S. diplomacy. It makes U.S. diplomacy that much more effective. And the 1933, and again, it was extemporaneous. Roosevelt tells Cordell Hull, whatever you do, don't agree to the principle of non-intervention. And for a number of different reasons, he winds up basically agreeing completely to the whole international law, American international law agenda, particularly recognizing the absolute sovereignty of American republics in domestic and foreign affairs. It was everything that they had been asking for, and that was revolutionary in many ways. It allowed the goodwill generated from that, allowed Roosevelt to sign a number of reciprocal trade agreements that allowed the U.S. to begin to recover from the Great Depression, to ready itself for the fight against fascism and militarism in Asia. The ideal of non-aggression and absolute sovereignty becomes enshrined in the UN Declaration, UN Charter. The regional alliance system that gets built on that acceptance, the OAS, the Rio Pact. The Rio Pact is a direct model, direct blueprint for NATO and then these other regional defense treaties elsewhere. So it allows the U.S., it creates the blueprint for the kind of regional alliance system that the U.S. puts in place after World War II. It also becomes the model for the U.S. to negotiate between regionalism and universalism, the OAS, figuring out the way in which to mobilize and this goes back to the question of obligation in a way. The U.S. would often claim obligation to the OAS in order to limit any restraints that the UN might place on it. So it didn't just create the regional alliance system, it created a model for how to negotiate that regional alliance system within a universal system, the UN. And the acceptance of social rights, including nationalization, became an important, I think, moral instrument in the Cold War fight. So it absolutely made the exercise of U.S. hegemony much more effective. One can make it even. I mean, this is a pretty broad argument, starting with 1607 and the Virginia Council, and then ending with Ronald Reagan. But one could think about a kind of empire unmoored, right? The U.S. is constantly trying to break out of this dependent immanent critique relationship to get even more abstract. And for a while, neoliberalism was in some ways seen, I think, could be understood as an attempt to end that immanent critique, and then even beyond neoliberalism, breaking out of the multilateral system that Latin America helped put into place was a kind of empire unmoored, leading to Iraq and leading to the kind of fumbling around that we've seen both economically and politically. So, what happens when an empire loses its stabilizing periphery and its ballast, how it becomes unmoored and how exactly it loses its ability to effectively project its power.
The last question, because I'm sure Greg would like, and all of you would like to carry on this conversation over a glass of wine. Juliana.
Sorry to keep you from drinking wine. I'll try to be short, very brief. Yeah, it's just some thoughts that came to mind that in terms of the use of political rights and civil liberties and how it's still used in the Freedom House ratings for countries all over the world. These very same categories. Yeah. So the idea also for your major question, if I may, just highlight some points out of this, the effect of the U.S. as a role model to some countries that whenever I think about Brazil, particularly for knowing Brazilian history better than the other countries in the region, and thinking about the occasions when the Brazilian regime would deviate from the U.S. model, the role model, then the U.S. would intervene, and then whenever these forces were crushed, other forces would say that the U.S. was a role model, sometimes openly, and that was a motto that was very indicative of this. They said, whatever is good for the U.S. is good for us. Yeah, makes sense.
So Brazil, when Brazil said that?
The idea of the recurrence of this model, because for the U.S., what I feel that was the main point in the interventions was sometimes the idea of this guaranteeing private property and establishing trade in U.S. terms most of the time, so guaranteeing that it would continue its flow of trade in some points, but not exactly the substance or the socio-economic rights, but some basic procedures to allow for trade relations. and not the substance. But the substance would come, would surface again and try, following up on what he said earlier, we would have democracy again, and we would have these liberal regimes because the US was such an important role model for the other countries in the region.
Yeah, I don't know if I would use the language of role model. Certainly there were obvious real incentives in which the U.S. made things possible, the U.S. capital made things possible. There were real allies and real classes and groups that U.S. foreign policy could connect to and organize the Western Hemisphere in a way that benefited the interests of those classes. I think that also that, I mean, going back to the question of effectiveness, there was a kind of, the kind of a reform capitalism that emerges in the 20th century that comes out, not exclusively, but to some degree in reaction to Latin American opposition to a kind of more raw and crude and brutal resource extraction, does create a much more stable economic environment, a political environment in countries that, the U.S. is able to, project its interests through the cultivation of a limited but real middle class, along with certain representatives of that class, as well as the other classes. So the degree to which that has evaporated as a result of wherever you want to locate the source of the evaporation, the rise of finance capital, the turn towards neoliberalism, the return to a much more brutal model of extraction, of resource extraction, particularly in Central America, Colombia, kind of undercuts the ground in which the U.S. can find allies in order, so it's not so much being, I think, a role model. And then the emergence of a new political class that sees its interests elsewhere, right? That sees its interests as not so much rejecting, this is why it's not a question, trying to avoid the question about whether it's neoliberal or not, the economics of Latin America, but diversifying their options, in terms of deepening integration among themselves, looking for sources of credit and capital in markets outside of the U.S. So I think that would be more explanatory than the U.S. as a role model. But certainly I think that, in ideological terms, I think that is one way of thinking about it.
Excellent. Well, before we disperse and before we thank Greg for his wonderful talk and responses, can I just ask everybody to remember to sign up? There is a piece of paper which Paolo is in control of, or it's over there. It's terribly important for us that we do have your signature for attendance, for reasons I don't want to go into right now, but it would be very good to have it. And but now let us join us all in thanking Greg for a wonderful